Welcome back, class. This is Chapter 3, the legal context of employment decisions. This is a shorter video, shorter presentation from me, but nonetheless very important. Being sued can be very expensive, even if you win. It can be very disruptive, and having contentious issues and lawsuits and even people filing grievances with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, things of this nature drain everybody's time and just indicate that something's not being done right in that organization. So we don't want any of this. We need to do what we can, do everything we can to minimize these legal problems and maintain a fair, consistent legal workplace. So first point I wanted to talk about is, I really wanted to underscore what Cassio says when he says that understanding these laws and their management implications is critical for all managers, not just HR professionals. The reason I wanted to underscore that is because ignorance can turn out to be very expensive. So not knowing important laws and regulations, as they say, ignorance is no excuse, and it's not going to help out. So really, our average managers, Joe and Jane manager, are going to be legal experts? No, and they shouldn't try to be, actually. That would be dysfunctional. But certainly some familiarity with some of the common things that get managers and their organizations into trouble will be really important. I would like to say that the implication of that is that you want to keep somebody in your organization that's up to date on these laws and regulations. If it's personnel matters or employee managers, oftentimes that would be the human resource professional, and that human resource professional should be up to date on these. In fact, that would be, could be and should be probably some of the selection process before hiring somebody into an HR position, to check their knowledge on some of these factors. However, these laws and regulations do change over time, and this HR person, who would be at least the employment law expert within the company, will need to keep up on the changes, attend workshops, and certainly you as a manager or boss in the company could keep an eye out to make sure that your HR coworkers are indeed staying up to date and knowledgeable about the ever-changing laws and regulations. However, certainly managers that don't work in human resources need to be familiar with a lot of these practices. So particularly if there's not a human resources person at your organization, you're going to have to be doubly knowledgeable about things that will get you into trouble. So you would be the one that would be going to training and workshops on how to avoid legal problems within the company. Fortunately, these workshops are pretty prevalent. In other words, they're not that difficult to find, and there's a lot of good ones out there. I know in the Pueblo area there's a employment law workshop once a year, and it's one of the most popular workshops that's attended by professionals. And I've attended it and found it to be pretty darn useful. So this would be the type of workshop where employment law specialists, attorneys that, not just regular attorneys that handle a wide variety of things, but attorneys that are specialists and experts on employment law can produce publications or workshops that will help you stay out of trouble. So I think in addition to keeping someone in your organization up to date and yourself up to date on these laws and regulations, it's important to know who to call. So that's related to what I said before. When there are questions about is this legal or is this not, and all kinds of things pop up in the workplace, it's amazing the kind of issues that arise when people work together in organizations. It's important to know who to call. So if you don't have the in-house expert, whether HR person or a legal counsel in-house, it's important to know who to call. So certainly wanting to find a reputable employment lawyer who's well grounded in these laws and regulations would be good. Also, an alternative is there's employers' councils that, at least in the United States, that offer help and resources. So for instance, in the Pueblo area, there's a Mountain States Employers Council that big part of what they do is offer training and actually legal advice to member organizations. So when these crazy issues come up that employers and managers want to know, well, the employee said this, is it legal if we say no, or we want to do this, will that get us into trouble? some of these firms like Mountain States Employers Council or the similar organizations in other locales can be extremely helpful. They know what issues employers are struggling with. And certainly the Society for Human Resource Management, even if you're not, if you're a finance manager, accounting manager, but you don't have an HR person in your firm or you're an entrepreneur, you might think about joining the Society for Human Resource Management, not to attend meetings and learn a ton about human resource management, but they do have access to member resources where you can go in and find out the answers to a lot of these legal questions, because a lot of these issues that employers are concerned about are very common across employers. So they're not things that are specific to only one company. They're things that pop up in a number of companies, and there's quite a bit of guidance out there in these various sources on how to do the right thing, how to avoid legal problems. An important part of this chapter to me when I read it is barriers, how to reduce and remove barriers that cause unfairness or illegalities or problems. So I think really what we're trying to do in organizations, a lot related in this chapter, is working toward equal employment opportunity. Equal employment opportunity, removing barriers that produce inequality. So I think that's what we're aiming for. Equal employment opportunity implies at least two things. First, that an evaluation of candidates for jobs in terms of characteristics that really do make a difference between success and failure. So when we're selecting somebody into the company, or within the company choosing who to promote or transfer to a different job, we're really making that evaluation based on characteristics that really do make a difference on the job, not things that don't matter: race, gender, religion, etc., etc. So focusing on job relevant criteria is a huge way to avoid problems and a huge way to promote fairness in the workplace. And then secondly, EEO implies that you have fair and equal treatment of employees on the job. So certainly that is important too. People notice inequality and inequity, so we've really got to watch out for fair and equal treatment and make sure that happens. And I think most of us at the personal level, sure, we're going to treat people fair. That's something that pretty much all of us believe in, but it's easy for misperceptions to creep in. For instance, maybe certain employees are more like you and they're easier to relate to. This was a classic in the past with women entering the managerial ranks. Thank goodness we progressed quite a bit on that now, but early on in some companies, maybe the organizational culture, a lot of the high earning, big money managers were golfers, and so they would meet and have business meetings on the golf course, or maybe even meet informally on the golf course. And at that time, in some organizations, not as many of the women were golfers, and so a lot of this kind of networking and decision making and hobnobbing and relationship building was happening in settings that women were not necessarily excluded from, but weren't included in. So I think a lot of this is just kind of thinking about ways to ensure that there's fair and equal treatment. Another example, we all have employees that are easier to work with, working for us, and employees that we find a little bit more challenging. And so it's really easy to kind of have the in-group employees, the employees that are kind of most favored, and to kind of have the more out-group employees that you're not mistreating them, but they're not in your inner circle just because you don't relate to them as well. You treat them nice, but you don't spend as much time with them. And so these kind of things can lead to misperceptions. We really just kind of have to watch our own behavior and kind of put on that critical hat on occasion and say, if I was this employee, how would I see that? So I think that can be quite important. And people are equity sensitive, some more than others. They may look and compare how they're being treated vis-a-vis a coworker and then make conclusions about whether or not they're being treated fairly. And I think certainly maintaining an open door, we want to encourage employees who feel there's some kind of unequal treatment going on to let us know about it. Don't kill the messenger. We need to know this. We want employees to either come to us, the boss, or another avenue within the company rather than going outside and hiring a lawyer that will sue us, or going outside to the government, maybe the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, filing a complaint that we're going to have to deal with. So if we can encourage open dialogue in the workplace and prevent some of these problems from going outside into places we don't want them to go, that is helpful. Even if we're not immediately happy to hear the complaint, we need to hear it, and we need to be receptive to it and thank the person that brings that complaint or issue to us and give us a chance to do something about it. That is a real blessing that they have provided us. I think in the chapter, Cassio talks about the 80% rule. Some people call it the 4/5 rule. I think this is an important thing to talk about. It's a good diagnostic to calculate. So this is where you look at, is the selection rate for the group in question less than 80% of the dominant group? So say that we're hiring engineers. Maybe in our organization, the dominant group in the engineering occupation is white males. Are females, are minorities applicants being hired in at least 4/5 that rate of the white males, at least 80%, right? So what this means is looking at applicants for a given position from gender groups, minority groups, and seeing if we're hiring at least 80% as many of the applicants from these other groups as we are for the dominant group. I'm hoping this is making sense. What I'm saying is that you look for inequities and try to figure out what's going on. Over time, if you have enough applicants, you can analyze this type of data and see, is there some kind of systematic discrimination going on? If you have very, very small numbers, you might not be able to do this, but it's a good diagnostic to think about. It may uncover unintentional discrimination. So I think it's worthwhile to do some of these diagnostics before you're sued by an outsider that feels discriminated against, to make sure your practices are fair. I think it's worthwhile touching on what Cassio says about personal history items. He says that you want to collect job-relevant information on a need-to-know basis, and I wholly agree with that. So you don't collect data or application information on a nice-to-know basis. You collect information that is job-relevant and need to know. That will help you stay out of trouble, because some of that other information will, potentially will get you in trouble. I know in Europe there's maybe different norms or customs on this, but here in the U.S., for instance, we don't want memberships or personal hobbies listed on resumes. We don't want to collect that information face-to-face in an interview process. Reason is, what if an employee says, I'm a member of a certain religious group, or you have no idea what kind of memberships or activities employees might be involved in, which might be harmless or innocuous, but could still kind of shade some of the hiring authorities or interviewers' perceptions. So a lot of that we really just want to know. It's back to what we talked about last semester of job analysis. What are the important knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics for effectiveness on a given job? Do the blueprint or the job specification, laying those out, and then design the process to collect that job relevant information. I think structured interviews are quite helpful. We'll talk more about these, much more about this during the selection chapter, the hiring chapter, but for instance, sometimes when interviewers are just trying to break the ice, that's slang for relax an applicant before we get into the difficult interview questions, maybe they'll say something like, so, you married? Any kids? What are your hobbies? These kind of things can lead to just inappropriate disclosure, or maybe even just outright discomfort from the interviewee. So really some structure. What do we say when we sit down with an applicant? What are the exact questions we're going to ask? What are some things we're not going to ask? Will help you avoid legal problems in that way. I think next I'd like to focus a little bit on just knowing yourself and knowing your own prejudices and stereotypes. We all have them. I have a PhD and spent tons of time in school and have studied perceptions and bias and read up on racism and all these kind of things, and certainly I have stereotypes too. We all do. We all are better served if we're aware of our stereotypes and prejudices. Why? Because we know a lot of these individuals that we may stereotype might not fit the stereotype. A lot of times we're going to be wrong. So stereotypes are pretty natural. In some cases they're useful, but we should be very much aware of stereotypes and certainly our prejudices. We should seek to extinguish or get rid of our prejudices and probably minimize the use of stereotypes because of the high error rate. As I say, a lot of the individuals we'll deal with won't fit that cognitive schema that we have in our mind toward a particular group, and we're going to look pretty foolish if we treat all people from a certain group in a similar way. We look biased, we look prejudiced, chauvinistic, low emotional intelligence. It's very easy to look like a buffoon if you rely on prejudices and stereotypes. So we need to do some self-insight, some self-discovery, learn what those are. Keep a critical eye and ear out for what you say and what you think, and then do the argument with yourself, the self-talk, right? What makes you say that? Where's your disconfirming evidence? What's your confirming evidence? Don't be too easy on yourself saying, yeah, I knew that was the case because he or she's a such and such. So I think keeping a critical eye and ear on ourselves, what we think, what we say, would be good. Think about times you have been kind of labeled or stereotyped. It generally doesn't feel good. Even me as a white male, I've been stereotyped before by people of other kind of groups that assumed I had certain belief systems because I was a white male, and I was kind of thrown by that. It didn't make any sense to me at all, so I could see where it would be upsetting or bothersome to people who this happens to more frequently. It makes no sense. So I think searching for disconfirming information to undermine your stereotypes is important. We all tend to seek for confirming information. Disconfirming information that violates our belief system, our stereotypes, tends to make us uncomfortable. But if we're going to grow as more complex, more intelligent human beings, we have to be open and indeed search for that disconfirming information that complicates our reality. So think about doing that. And I think as a manager, also as a boss, as an MBA graduate, you need to take a stand. So this is difficult for some of us to do when we hear inappropriate jokes, prejudice, stereotypes. Even if nobody around us is in this small group that this is being shared with is not offended, I think we need to take a stand. We need to be courageous and say, look, I don't believe that, or I don't think that's appropriate, or I don't want to hear that here, or I disagree. And so this would be very important. It's going to show that you're a person of integrity. It's going to show you're a person that doesn't tolerate that. It's going to have a huge influence on the behavior and climate within your own work group. So I think even though it may take a little gumption or courage to do that, it's going to have some strong positive effects. In fact, as a manager, you can be in legal trouble if you don't step up when these kind of illegal, unfair, prejudice, bias activities are going on. You can get yourself and your company into legal trouble. So even if you're not inclined to that kind of behavior of stepping up and disputing, squelching that kind of behavior, you need to do it. Otherwise, you'll place yourself and or your organization in legal jeopardy. And then finally, I think the last point I'd like to make related to Chapter 3 is that encourage others to help you see through their eyes. So if there are people who are different from you, race, gender, belief systems, learn from these people. Again, complicate your reality, build your empathy, build your understanding. I think it's not always, it's easier for some people than others to be empathic, and I think if you can get some of your coworkers and employees, and maybe even applicants, to share their thoughts, things they've encountered, prejudices they've run into, things that irritate them when they're treated certain ways, just ask them to help you see things through their eyes. It will enrich your ability to relate to others, and it will, ultimately, it's going to make you a more effective manager. And it's, again, back to encouraging people to bring issues to your attention. I would think somebody that you've encouraged and talked to in this way, help me see things through your eyes. I really grew up as you see me, and you've had different experiences. I'd really like to learn from your experiences and things that you've encountered in the workplace that have been positive and negative. I think those kind of conversations will build bridges that will enable that employee to come to you when things are going on that shouldn't be going on, and not feel that they have to go externally to the attorney or to the government commission of some sort.